Hi, welcome. Welcome
Hi.
to the IDRiM
Thanks.
Cafe Talk. This is our 5th coffee talk, and we are also recording this. I hope it's okay with you. Okay, thank you. So please introduce yourself, and then you have 10 minutes. Thank you, Alexandra.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm excited to be here today. It's going to be a fun, well, maybe not so fun when we actually get to the subject matter, but it's going to be an interesting discussion, I think. So I'll just try and share my screen here first. And then I'll just start. Can everyone see? Yeah, no, yes?
You see it, yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, a little bit slow today. Let me just get back on my... All right, so thanks again. I'm happy to be here, happy to talk about this topic. So my name is Alexandra Fisher. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Exeter. But as you can tell from my accent, probably I'm actually Canadian from the west coast of Canada, and my background is in social psychology. But today I'll just be giving a quick and relatively brief overview of some gender inequalities that have emerged during COVID-19. And then we'll kind of get to talk about it a little bit more, and I'm excited to hear what other speakers have to say too. So basically I've structured my talk around 3 questions. The first being, has COVID-19 exposed pre-existing gender inequalities? The second is, has COVID-19 revealed any new gender differences? And then the third, what can be done to reduce gender inequalities? And so I'll touch briefly on each of these questions throughout the talk. So first, just to put it bluntly, yes, COVID-19 has amplified pre-existing gender inequalities across a number of different domains. So for example, in health and well-being, although the severity and mortality rate was twice as high for men as it was for women in the early stages of the pandemic, there's been a disproportionate kind of impact on women's mental health. So with women reporting greater stress, anxiety, and psychological distress during those early stages of the pandemic in countries like that were collecting data on this, like Spain, Hungary, and Israel. There's also been quite a disproportionate impact on women's reproductive and physical health in terms of in those early stages of the pandemic, when women's services, women's clinics, and reproductive health services were being reallocated, resources around those services being reallocated to the care of COVID-19 patients. So again, a disproportionate kind of toll on those services for women. We've also seen inequalities increase within the home. So even before the pandemic, on average, women complete about 3 times as much household work, domestic work, and care work than men. And we've seen that a kind of increase, that discrepancy increase, especially among people with children. So mothers, for example, increased their domestic labor and also scaled back on their work hours, whereas men also tended to increase their their participation in the domestic sphere, but their work hours remained unchanged. So not making that kind of scaling back on work that women were making, which can have kind of economic consequences then for women. Another kind of important point too, which I'll return to later, is this kind of reality that women also complete the majority of invisible and unpaid care work. So when family members get ill, or children are home from school and aren't able to go to school, or sick relatives or elderly relatives that need extra support and care, it's predominantly women who are providing that care. And again, that's unpaid care work that is taken away from other aspects of their lives, and especially their kind of economic work. And then we also saw gender-based violence skyrocket during the pandemic, especially those early stages when countries were locking down. So here's just some data coming from some of the countries that had collected data on the domestic violence reports. So on average, seeing in these countries anyway, these examples, about a 30% increase in reports of domestic violence in places like Argentina, France, Singapore, United Kingdom, and the UN average, or the UN estimates on average, domestic violence has increased by 50%. And so this is kind of, there's all different kind of stats around the gender-based violence as well in reporting, in the sense that some countries and some cities have reported decreased reports of domestic violence versus some have reported like an extreme kind of increase. And again, this is related to different barriers to reporting and different service closures in different areas. So in some cases, with lockdown and the closure of services, it meant there's not a phone line, or that there's not the same kind of reporting opportunities that women have, or being locked down with your abuser. Again, less opportunity perhaps to actually report domestic violence. So on average, they believe that domestic violence has increased over this time. But again, it's kind of depends on where you look and how it's being reported as well. In work and poverty, we also know already pre-pandemic that women on average earn less money and occupy more precarious positions. So they're more likely to be employed in the informal economy and in service sector positions like hospitality, food, retail, service sectors that were hit particularly hard by the early stages of the pandemic by lockdowns, as they're often kind of sectors that are client facing, and so obviously couldn't continue the same way with the pandemic. And as a result, women's poverty rate increased from to about 10, or is expected to increase about 10 to 12%, with men's also expecting to increase, but not to the same extent. And then another important point too is that 70% of the healthcare, global kind of healthcare force is made up of women, comprised of women. And so on average, women are also kind of at the face and at the front line of the pandemic, and as a result, more likely to risk infection, especially when we think of personal protective equipment and how often that equipment itself is even made for a male default. And so it's often not as protective for women who are using it. And we kind of see this unfolding in data that was coming out of Spain, for example, where looking at all of healthcare workers who are infected with COVID, again, there's a huge gender discrepancy there, where 28% of all male healthcare workers ended up infected with COVID, compared to 72% of all female healthcare workers becoming infected with COVID-19 in those first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic in Spain. But some new gender differences have also emerged. So we've seen, for example, in leadership, that researchers have found that female-led countries actually locked down more quickly and had fewer deaths than comparable male-led countries. So these are countries matched on gender equality, GDP, population size, urban agglomeration. So kind of a positive impact there of female leadership, at least. And this is just the raw data from this particular paper. So not the comparable countries. This is just on average, all the male countries that they had in the sample. The death rate for them was about 2,000 compared to the death rate of COVID-19 in the female-led countries was about half that. But again, this is not the comparable data, but it gives you kind of a sense of the difference. So where do we go from here? I'll just kind of briefly touch on a couple points that I came across when reading the literature coming out of this pandemic, and also a couple kind of more social psychological points. So first, what I saw a lot is the need for actually correct and accurate reporting and understanding of impact of COVID-19 and the needs of the population by identity, by gender, and other identities. So for example, of like the 200 countries that submitted COVID data to the UN, only 37% of those countries actually disaggregated their data by sex, gender. And what's more is of that, it was all a very binary conceptualization of gender. So we don't know enough about the actual gender impact based on those early kind of reporting from countries. And we don't know about folks that are outside that gender binary as well, or other intersectional kind of considerations and other identities, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, things like that. So kind of this pressing need to actually assess and kind of collect important data so we actually know what parts of the population are most vulnerable to the impact of COVID-19 and how to actually support those populations. The next piece is then to, of course, engage in creating responsive policy. So policy that is gender sensitive or identity sensitive and takes into account these places where the inequalities are greatest. So in the example of gender, that's in addressing violence and addressing the unpaid care burden that women are facing and the economic security of women. So again, here's just a quick example of the proportion of gender sensitive policy that's collected by the Global Gender Response Tracker. So these are just kind of the total measures, policy response measures to COVID-19 and the proportion of which that were actually gender sensitive here in yellow across continent. And then more specifically, the proportion that addressed these issues like unpaid care, women's economic security, and violence against women. So you can see it's a positive thing that these policies do exist, but we're still kind of lagging behind in actually creating policy that is gender sensitive across the board. And then the last kind of piece from a more social psychological perspective is the need to kind of tackle some of these underlying gender role stereotypes and expectations that underpin these discrepancies in unpaid care work especially. So this expectation that women are kind of more caring or that they should be the ones caring for children, elderly parents, things like that. There needs to be kind of a transformation of both that balance within the home. So we need more men participating in this type of care work, this unpaid and invisible care work that women are doing that is taking away from their economic opportunities or taking away from other aspects of their life, as well as also globally and societally placing a higher value on this kind of work. So even the discrepancy and the segregation of men and women into different sectors, caring sectors, non-caring sectors, we need to place a higher value on both paid care work that's already being done and that unpaid care work and provide supplements and support for people who are doing this unpaid care work. Okay, and then just to wrap up, kind of the lessons learned from these early stages and this early data is that there's a clear need to prioritize gender and the need for more responsive, inclusive, and resilient policy that accounts for gender and other identities in order to kind of understand what populations need support and what kind of support that they need. And then, as I was mentioning, this need to recognize and kind of transform the value of unpaid care work and place a higher value on it and supplement people for doing it. All right, and that's it for me today. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for coming, and I'm excited to hear the next speakers.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. It was very interesting. And now we will continue with the next speakers, and then at the end we will have discussion and question and answer session. Thank you again. So the next speaker is Eleanor Bake from Northumbria University. Leanne. Hi.
Sorry, I'm working on two
Sorry
screens.
if I pronounced your name wrong.
No, it's all right, it's Leanne, that's fine, don't worry about it.
Okay. So welcome, Liana, and the floor is yours.
Okay.
Please introduce yourself first and then the presentation.
Okay, I don't have any slides, so I'm just going to really chat through just some points I've made through my experience as a union rep. So my name's Leanne. I'm from Northumbria University. I work in the Department of Geography and Environmental Science. I'm a senior lecturer. I was invited to this cafe by Ashley, and I'm speaking here today in my role as a trade union rep. So I'm a representative for the Universities and College Union for my department, and I represent the concerns of staff in terms of workload, pensions, things like that. I want to give a little bit of context about me and my experience during the pandemic, because I think compared to other people, I've had a pretty privileged time during the pandemic. I've got a partner, I've got no kids, so I didn't have caring responsibilities apart from seeing my parents. And I'm also a computer modeler, so all of my research and work could be done fairly easily over the internet. So all of the points I'm going to bring up here, or just have that in context, are from stories I've heard as a rep, and also from various surveys that have been conducted by the union on a national basis, and also within my university. Okay, so before the pandemic, the union reported that in the higher education and further education sector of the UK, staff, so that's both men and women, everyone, they worked on average about 50.9 hours a week. Now our working week is 37 hours. So we already are in a situation where we're putting more time into work than we're contracted for. Our workloads are they're inflated. Over the past, so from 2016 to 2019, we're still talking pre-pandemic, 83% of those who are surveyed reported that the pace and their intensity of their workload had increased. And when we start to think of gender differences, so all staff are already working more than 2 days unpaid work anyway. Women worked on average about 2.5 hours more than men on top of that. So already there is a sort of gender difference before the pandemic. So when the pandemic hit the UK, March 2020, that was our first lockdown. What happened at universities, and the universities are largely closed, teaching moved online. And because of that, everyone had to work at home. Most businesses had to work at home. So the situation we found ourselves in, or a lot of staff found themselves in, as if they had kids or they had significant caring responsibilities, they had to do that on top of their home life in the same sort of environment that I'm sitting in now. So like I said, I'm pretty privileged. I'd have no one else in this house right now. So I was quite happy being able to work from home. So after the pandemic, during the pandemic, our union, the UCU, and also Advanced HE, the United Kingdom, they conducted some surveys which really, couple of things that really reinforced what Alexandra actually talked about in terms of if you are found to be in an unequal position or on the end of inequality before the pandemic generally exacerbated that. And also pastoral and caring responsibilities mainly being on women. So I don't think I'm saying anything terribly different what Alexandra said, but it's just mainly focused in the university environment. So the UCU reported that those who filled in the survey, 4 out of 5 university and college staff were struggling because of the pandemic, because of various reasons. About 57% found their workload had increased, and this is already on top of an inflated workload before the pandemic. And about 23% felt that they were working harder. But Advanced HE came out with more sort of granular statistics which say women bore the brunt of domestic and caring responsibilities. I think this is reflected across every sector. From the shift from going in the classroom to online, women found that harder to adapt to. And I think that's just a function of them, again, having to manage caring and moving online with teaching and research. And as a result, women generally found themselves less productive in terms of their work. Now we want to break that down further, and we know that they're not just gender inequalities in academia. There's inequalities based on ethnicity, based on gender identity, on sexuality, on if you have a disability or not. And these group of people were more likely to report much higher workloads during the pandemic. And this was found for maybe a couple of reasons. It was reflected that this group of individuals tend to take on within university more pastoral roles, and that's certainly true that women tend to take on those roles. And during the first lockdown, I was a program leader, and I certainly had a huge workload because the amount of worried students asking, concerned about their degrees. So that's one point. And the second point why Black, Asian, ethnic minority women, LGBTQ, disabled staff, etc., they were putting more work into their teaching because we moved from like I say, a laboratory classroom to a blended learning environment. And we know through the UCU that when we get module feedback from students, because university here is increasingly commercialized, there's a bias in that module feedback against these group of people. So BAME women or BAME individuals, LGBTQ, they tend to get statistically significantly like worse feedback in module evaluation. So if we're having this huge shift in teaching methods, of course, you know, they're already in a position where the feedback tends to be worse for those individuals. So they're definitely going to put excessive amount of work into making the student experience much better online. So there's that. I want to sort of end on a positive as well. So while we're sort of moving, we're still in the pandemic, but we're moving kind of back towards normality. I think informally, the conversations I've had, a lot more of my colleagues are happier when they've got the flexibility to be able to work between home and the university. So we're undergoing a project currently at Northumbria to develop a new way of working, which I think places a lot more trust on the staff to manage their workloads and definitely be more flexible. So I think that's one good thing that's come out of it, that the sky doesn't fall in if no one's in work. We're able to work from home now. We've experienced it. Children are back in school, so that there is that sort of change. So yeah, I just want to end with just reinforce what was said. If it has mostly exacerbated any inequalities that were there from my point of view, and it's definitely that women tend to be the carers, tend to have the pastoral roles in universities, and that has impacted their workload, their productivity, and also their ability to adapt to what happened during COVID. So thank you for listening. Sorry I didn't have any slides. I hope that was okay, and I hope everyone followed.
Thank you very much, Leanne. So it was interesting to hear also your experience as a woman, but now we have a male perspective, and Mark will share with us also his experience during COVID-19.
Yeah, sure. Just share my screen. Can you see my screen?
So yes, it's perfect. The floor is yours, Mark.
Perfect. So I'm coming from this more of a male perspective of gender equality, looking at what I was thinking before the pandemic and then during the pandemic. So for me, let's quickly go about my background. So I'm from Middlesbrough in the northeast of England. So it's an area that is very deprived, quite an area that feels like it doesn't talk about social issues a lot. I also come from a predominantly male home. So most of my family, I only have one female in my life, which is my grandmother. So I come from a background that is very much male dominated. And previously my research had been more focused on social sciences, like weather and climate change. Now I'm more focused on people's perception and background, so I've moved more towards a social scientist. So before COVID-19, I knew that gender issues were around, and I knew that there were issues around gender equality, but, and this is being completely honest, they were not at the forefront of my mind. So I knew that society was very much balanced towards males, even in the UK, which claims to be one of the more gender equality countries. But I've always felt that that balance will readdress itself, even if it is slowly, and that women were definitely helping to readdress this balance. But then the pandemic hit, in my opinion, really started to change very quickly. And the biggest turning point was the case of Sarah Everard. That was the point where I started to change and really question everything. So for those who don't know much about the Sarah Everard case, Sarah Everard was a 33-year-old marketing executive from York. On the 3rd of March 2021, whilst walking home from a friend's house in London, she was abducted and went missing. On the 9th of March, 6 days later, a police officer called Wayne Cousins was arrested on suspicion of murder. And then her body was found just a day later, over 30 miles away in Kent. And this started to raise a big question. And we knew that there were numerous amount of women who were getting murdered every week in the UK. But the reason why this one really brought it home was that she was just walking home from a friend. She didn't know the person who attacked her. And the fact that the person who murdered her and raped her was a police officer who was in charge of looking after public safety. So this really started to bring, so for me, that was when it started bringing home something's not quite right here. The London Mayor, Steve Khan, said that London streets are not safe for women or girls to walk. And the Home Secretary said that new laws were being considered to protect women against sexual harassment in the public. But then on the day of her body, which was 7 days after her body had been found, 7 days on Clapham Common, there was a vigil for her, and this was attended by the Duchess of Cambridge. However, after the Duchess of Cambridge had left and it turned into the evening, this was forcibly broken up by the Metropolitan Police, the same police force that Wayne Cousins was a member of. As we can see here, the media were condemning the actions of forcibly arresting people who were attending a silent vigil. The politicians were equally, including the Prime Minister, were equally condemning this, whilst later on he did backtrack on this, but also the public anger was really loud. And in the event was that it led to a big protest, I think a couple of days later from the exact date. And an independent report later has said that the police had incorrectly interpreted coronavirus-related restrictions. So it must remember that the UK was still under certain restrictions at the time, but the restrictions weren't supposed to stifle vigils or protests, because at the time we were still seeing anti-lockdown protests. And so Wayne Cousins was jailed on the 30th of September. Sadly though, some males you could see that were still victim blaming. So I give the example of the North Yorkshire Police, the police firefight and crime commissioner, Philip Abbott, who said that women needed to be more streetwise. Unsurprisingly, this released another backlash against this, and 2 weeks later he resigned after a no confidence vote. After this case, the Met stated that women should consider shouting out to a passerby, running into a house, knock on a door, or wave a bus down if they're in a position to do so, or call 999 to make sure that the police officer is being legitimate. Women shouldn't have to do this. Women shouldn't have to be waving buses down because they're concerned that that this arrest is legitimate. But also, and this is a point that Alexandra had touched on earlier, domestic violence. Domestic violence, as defined by the UN, is a pattern of behaviour in any relationship that is used to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. Now, figures show that before the pandemic, 1.6 million women aged between 16 and 74 experienced domestic violence. At the same time, 757,000 men experienced domestic violence. Now, during the pandemic, isolation was becoming a part of it, where we were locked in, and isolation is regularly used by perpetrators for further control in a part of domestic violence and the abuse of the victims being subjected to. Now, during COVID-19, what was found was that perpetrators were not allowed out for exercise or to go to the shops, further isolating them and controlling their physical whereabouts and isolating them from their families and friends. And the problem was that there was a sense that, especially for women who were wanting to get out, they felt like they had no way of getting out, because if they got out, will the police force, will the law state that they didn't have a legitimate reason to be out of the house during the lockdown. So what we'd seen was that in the first 3 months, a 65% increase in calls to the National Abuse Helpline. And this equated, we estimate, of nearly 260,000 domestic abuse offences were being recorded. And a charity called Refuge had seen a 150% increase on visits on their own website 7 days into the first lockdown, so even before the end of March 2020. WomenAid also reported during the first 3 months that 58% of their 26 refuge services had seen an increase, 80% of community-based services had seen an increase, 91% of the 22 online support services seen an increase, and 81% of the 31 telephone support services seen an increase. So I come from a development and background as well now, and so for me, this raises a big question. The UK likes to portray itself as being at the forefront of sustainable development. But my question is, we're failing on domestic violence. And Sarah Everard's case is an example of this, where in 5.2, it states that the Sustainable Development Goals eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls in public and private spheres. And I think there's an argument that what the pandemic has highlighted in some respects as well is the Sarah Everard Vigil in 5.5 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which says ensure women full and effective participation in equal opportunity for leadership at all levels in making political decisions, economic and public life. In the case of this, my question argues, didn't the breaking up of that vigil stop them having a full and effective participation in calling for change? So after all this, I started to question everything around me. And I was like, how in 2021 can the UK be so gender equality? How can we let this continue under our very noses? How can we, as in the UK, be claimed to be one of the most gender equality countries when the scale of violence against women that we're seeing is happening? Other thing is, what is the UK government doing about this issue? I feel that the UK government, this from my perspective, that the UK government is not tackling this very seriously. I mean, I take the example of what just happened in the last few weeks, where the Prime Minister's own father was being accused of sexual harassment, and one of his senior politicians said that I don't believe her. What message does that portray to women who are being abused? And then finally, and I think this is what all males should be questioning, as a male, what can we do? What can we do to stop this from happening? Just to quickly touch on, this year, the UK did pass the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, which finally gives a legal definition of domestic abuse, which recognises children as the victim in their own right. But it also puts some legal duty on councils to fund services for victims in a safe accommodation when they finally leave for domestic abuse, and new criminal offences including post-separation coercive control, non-fatal strangulation, and threats to disclose private sexual images. But this is a big question, and I always have, is why did it take 3 years when we knew this was quite urgent to get from 2018, spring 2018 to now? Surely it should have been passed much sooner. So my final thoughts is COVID-19 in terms of gender equality has been both good and bad. Short term, mostly negative. We've seen increases in domestic violence. We've seen an increased reliance, as both Leanne and Alexandra said, on women for childcare and for the home setting. But long term, I think this could be more of a positive thing. It's finally getting society to talk about gender equality and to actually take note for the first time. And just to end, and I think Amelia will recognize this, just want to show this. Every name here is a woman who has been killed by a man this year. In the UK, statistically, every 3 days, a woman is killed by a man. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this presentation. We will discuss later on all these aspects, but now I would like to give the floor to our last speaker, and we will hear the view of a politician now. So I would like to welcome Amelia Womack, who is the current deputy leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. So Amelia, welcome. Welcome to our coffee talk.
Thank you so much. Sorry.
I would like to give you the floor. Do you have a presentation or it's just a talk?
Just a talk.
Okay, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Gender equality has been long fought for, with progress being slow. And I feel like we do stand on the shoulders of giants when it comes to many of the issues that have been worked to historically be addressed, whether that's even changes in domestic abuse bills, whether that's changes in even women's participation in politics. These are rights that have been hard fought and won. And I think that part of the pandemic has shown me that although one can be reversed or undermined at any moment in our history, because this is what risk is. This is what, when we hit times of disaster, we see people's rights being rolled back. And we see women being at the forefront of those changes, with more, obviously, the intersections of that as well, women of colour, disabled women, finding that life has become harder. We just need to look at disasters like Hurricane Katrina, where the stadiums where people were sheltering, there were reports of women being raped once they had survived those hurricanes, but were just trying to get a night's sleep in that disaster. When the pandemic hit, in the UK, we were told basically that we couldn't foresee what was going to happen. And I think that takes away from the fact that we had the alarm bell from China. We had a couple of months' notice about what the reality of the pandemic would look like. And we were already getting reports of the increase of domestic abuse in China and other countries that had been hit by COVID already. We had a 3-week warning from Italy. Again, reports of increases of domestic abuse and violence increasing in that country. I worked with politicians from across the different devolved parliaments and the different political divides to talk about this before we locked down, because it was going to be vital that we increased our domestic violence services and ensured that we were putting support at the community level, and as well as acknowledging the impacts on the national level. This took weeks, even months, to be properly acknowledged. And we did see a rise in understanding of concern of people in their community, but especially women in our community. During one government press conference, Priti Patel wrote the emergency number for women to call who were experiencing violence on her hand, to try and expose a new channel of communication for those who may not be able to safely make calls or safely look up that number. But that wasn't enough soon enough. It didn't really match. And I think this is what I see in all of these issues. What comes first? The people, government, or other issues, you talk about business, but in this case, people or government, which comes first? And the government wasn't moving as quickly as the people, because we did see people caring in a different way. We saw people's an upturn in people's understanding of women's rights at home through the lens of domestic abuse and violence. but the government just simply was not fast enough to put that support into the community level, to put the communications out there and ensure that women's safety was foregrounded. Currently, we saw that increase in the number of people visiting websites for domestic abuse and violence. But in our communities, there were still women were waiting at the moment to even access things like talking therapy for those who have survived abuse or are still surviving abuse. There's a 9-month to 18-month wait for that talking therapy in our communities. And so when we look at these statistics on domestic violence, we must remember those women who don't add into those figures because they take their own lives or try to take their own lives to escape abuse and their partners. They see that as their only way out. And about 30 women a day do that, causing sometimes long-term damage. We see some women who have tried to strangle themselves will have, as a result of a reduction of oxygen to their brains, they will have they'll have ongoing issues of brain damage as a result of that. And we will see that women obviously go on to live with scars and injuries in many different ways as a result. These women simply aren't recorded as women who have died or been injured as a result of domestic abuse, because our laws aren't strong enough at the moment to be recording that. Which means that we don't even have those figures of understanding the psychological abuse that was happening in people's homes during lockdown and the pandemic, that meant that so many women were completely isolated and had no other way out. I find this quite tragic, actually, the role of psychological abuse and women taking their own lives or attempting to take their own lives, because I think that for lots of people who have lost women in their lives, they reflect quite differently on maybe what their experiences were and can sometimes see historic abuse in their families, amongst their friends, that just hadn't been exposed. But then the kind of penny drops when we start to talk about this more. We've talked a bit about Sarah Everard, and I also wanted to bring this moment up. Alongside Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Sarah Everard was again a moment where rights and people's rights were catapulted to the foreground. Let's not forget that we had that during the Me Too movement, and many of those policies that women were looking to put in place around that time, if we'd actually done that work, we would have been in a much stronger, more resilient place when the pandemic hit. I think that we too often drag our feet. I've done work on making misogyny a hate crime. So what we see is misogyny happening in our streets, and it is interesting. I'm currently in London. I don't live in London, so I assume that this is a result of Sarah Everard. But on the trains and I think on the tubes, there are signs about what sexual harassment is, and they've got signs saying that catcalling is sexual harassment, leaning against a woman inappropriately is sexual harassment. And these were issues that I've personally been trying to highlight and work against through the work of making misogyny a hate crime, that went unnoticed, and people joked at me, oh, you're trying to make catcalling illegal. I don't know why people are fighting for their rights to catcall at women, but I certainly, if people are fighting for those rights, I'm certainly quite happy to make that illegal, because it's a kind of a completely undermining way of experience that women have in our streets. But it took this moment, and it took that moment during lockdown as well, for the attention to be raised on the fact that women weren't safe, and the fact that women were facing abuse from people they knew and people they didn't, that people who are often the perpetrators of abuse have long histories of misogyny, as we saw with Wayne Couzens. We also, I think that the first the first presentation really captured the points that I wanted to raise of shared care not really being shared. So women doing 2 or 3 jobs in their homes. This is all happening behind closed doors. And I think that that was what added to this fear of what was going to be revealed when doors opened up again. And it really struck me that although during lockdown, we all had the same experience in the UK, so many of us watched Tiger King, or I don't know. I mean, I didn't do the sourdough starter kit, but you know, lots of people had the same experiences, but not a single person experienced the same thing. And I think that we were hyper aware that people's lived experiences are completely different when we are shut away, and that we are unable to talk and communicate with our friends in a safe way. That means that we are able to expose the reality of diverse lives. I think that the pandemic exposed these risks, and the pandemic showed that women, just as Me Too did, that women's safety has not been accounted for, that the cuts to domestic violence services, rape crisis centres, reproductive supports has been impacting women. And the whole point of those networks are to be there during times of crisis. And when during a time of crisis, we were always going to see women being failed, because they've been failed in the years and the decade running up to that moment. We know that women, when we have more women in politics, that we do have stronger rights for women. And I do, as I said before, we really stand on the shoulders of giants, of those who have made a difference. And I feel like it was still, the right work was very clear about what should have been happening. It was led by, rightly led by women, but again, being that support and investment being dragged down as a fringe issue quite often, rather than a campaign for the rights of 51% of the population. So politics is slow. I just want to reflect on the previous presentation. Politics is a slow moving machine, but we need to be, that moment of lockdown was a flashpoint. And we were able to move things through, an emergency response through faster. And that needed to be foregrounded in an intersectional way that recognised that not just women were at the forefront of many of these issues. When we look at the issue of face masks in hospitals and PPE not fitting women's faces and making them more dangerous because of the male default. Again, that was true for different races. There was people of color were once again being failed. Women of color were being failed even further. We've seen this time and time again, and I think that when we talk about our analysis of COVID, it has to be intersectional at every single aspect, because otherwise we create more missing figures, like more missing figures and more missing ways that we can push our policies to ensure that we have genuine equality and create something stronger and more resilient. And you know, it does go back to many of these issues. I think women, from the lack of diversity in politics, that then means that there's a lack of diversity of prioritizing policies that reflect the lived experiences of women, that mean at a time of crisis, that resilience quite simply isn't there. This has been such an important and thought-provoking session. And I think that when we focus on women's rights, we can build a better society for everyone. Everyone is harmed by this patriarchal society. And I, really stand shoulder to shoulder to all of those exhausted women who have been doing 2-3 jobs during the pandemic as a result of their caring responsibilities on top of their usual jobs, those women who have experienced abuse in their own homes while being isolated by their partners to increase the coercive control over them, those women who have been in insecure work that has meant that they have not been unable to make ends meet during the pandemic. And we must expose and platform all of these stories to ensure that simply we get those right policies in place to make a more resilient society.
So Amelia, thank you very much.